We're here today to address a refugee crisis in America. Now, I never thought that I would have to use those words on the floor of the Senate, but there is no other way to describe what is happening on our southern border. What is happening in Central America, the violence, the kidnappings, the failure of the rule of law, is the root cause of the problem and is threatening tens of thousands of families and thousands of children, causing a refugee crisis that is simply unacceptable. Unacceptable in America, unacceptable in our hemisphere. Now, let's be clear, it's being caused in large measure by thousands in Central America who believe it is better to run for their lives and risk dying than stay and die for sure. It is a nearly 2,000-mile journey from these countries to the U.S. border. These families are not undertaking this journey lightly. My Republican colleagues make it sound as though parents are willingly choosing to risk their children's lives, send them on a 2,000-mile journey fraught with smugglers, thieves, child abductors, sex traffickers, as if that's really a choice. They're parents, just as we are parents. And I, as a parent, cannot imagine having to make that choice, to send them on a perilous journey with no guarantees of survival, except out of an absolute fear for their lives if they stay. To politicize the decision to send a child away as opportunistic, as a way to take advantage of American law, is as cynical as a position as I have ever heard. First of all, no deferred action, nothing that we did for dreamers in this country, would help any of these people. They don't qualify under any elements of that provision. And the immigration reform that was passed here in the Senate by a broad bipartisan vote, with about 68 votes, would not help any one of these people, because they would have had to be in the country by December 31st of 2011. So nothing in that law is an attraction. Nothing. Yet Republicans in the House of Representatives won't even take a vote on immigration reform. Frankly, my Republican friends can't have it both ways. They can't criticize the president, in fact, sue the president for abusing his executive authority, and at the same time come to this floor and criticize him for a lack of leadership when they won't even cast a vote. That is nothing if not totally and transparently political. Now, this is not about a welcome mat. It's a desperate effort on the part of thousands of parents to do what parents instinctively do, and that is do what you must do to protect your child from the threats of violence and death at home, even if it means sending them away. Let's be clear, first and foremost, violence and crime are a pandemic that sadly has become part of life in Central America, in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Honduras has the highest per capita murder rate in the world. In the world. El Salvador and Guatemala are in the top 5 in the world. Second, more than 80% of the illicit drugs coming from South America to the United States travel through Central America. Drug traffickers and local gangs harass and extort local residents, and they're able to use their profits to corrupt the police, judicial system, and government institutions. Thirdly, rates of poverty and inequality in these countries are sky high, while levels of economic growth and development lag far behind other countries in Latin America. And the recent report by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees found that the majority of the minors they interviewed here in the United States had left their home country out of fear. The bottom line is that we must attack this problem from a foreign policy perspective, from a refugee perspective, from a national security perspective. We need to do all that we can to stabilize the situation in Central America and stop the flow of children and refugees to our border. Mr. President, after a full year of squandering every conceivable opportunity to pass common sense immigration reform, Speaker Boehner has admitted that his party has killed any prospects for reform. Now we have to deal with the political consequences of the Republican leadership's obstructionism. So I fully support the President's efforts to fix some of the most urgent problems facing our nation's broken immigration system. And I look forward to seeing those families who are here and eligible receive relief from deportation as we continue to advocate for a permanent legislative solution. In the meantime, we need to provide emergency funding to deal with this refugee crisis. To begin with, the President's supplemental appropriation request is a very tough pro-enforcement legislation. By the way, as we talk about more money for enforcement, we're actually doing a good job in enforcement on the border. Why do I say that? Because the reason that we know of the size of the refugee challenge that we are facing is because we are interdicting, apprehending these people at the border and then putting them in detention facilities. So it's not that the Border Patrol isn't doing their jobs. They are. Yet we have an appropriations bill supplemental request being put before us, $3.7 billion for enforcement, homeland security, and other resources. It provides critical funding to prosecute traffickers who are bringing these kids here. And that's what my Republican colleagues have been asking for. But let's be clear, we need to keep this supplemental clean and free of writers and authorizing language. If we don't keep it clean, it will never get passed. And one person will want to add part of immigration reform, then another will want to have another part. The bottom line is this body already passed, with over 68 votes, comprehensive immigration reform. We don't need to have a debate on this bill that's something that we've already passed on. We need to deal with the emergency. Now, I love it when my Republican friends scream for action. This is emergency funding, and it's as conservative as it gets, focused almost entirely on enforcement. The bill is giving Republicans what they've always asked for, more money for border enforcement, especially in the border states. So we need to provide the President with the money so that he can handle the refugee crisis. It's what we expect of nations around the world. It's what we tell other nations around the world. It's the history of America to treat refugees appropriately and according to international standards. Now, some of these children and families are refugees, and some of them are not. The children who have claims should be able to pursue those claims with a day in court under existing U.S. law. If they lose, they'll be deported. We have a legal system to address the crisis. Let's use it, and let's give the President the resources he needs to enforce it. The President's supplemental appropriations request, in my mind, is an essential beginning, but I hope that the administration will consider the 20-point plan that I laid out that deals in part, and I think importantly, with the root causes. Because if we spend $3.7 billion for enforcement and spend what we have been spending, which is about $110 million among 5 countries in Central America to create citizen security so that people don't flee in the first place, well, it seems to me that we have this equation a little wrong. We're going to spend $3.5 billion to deal with the consequences, but we're going to spend $110 million to deal with the cause. If we don't deal with the cause, guess what? There'll never be enough money, and there will always be a continuing challenge of refugees fleeing the violence in their countries. So I hope that will increase aid for citizen security directed to help them with our law enforcement entities, to deal with the security in their countries, to deal with the drug traffickers, to deal with the gangs, to be able to create a sense of security in your neighborhood so that you don't flee the country, so it isn't likely that your mother or father will be killed in front of you, or your brother will be killed, or your sister will be raped, which is increasingly the stories that are heard from these individuals. and that will do it while implementing humane reforms that don't put innocent children in harm's way. South of our border, we're seeing unprecedented violence, unprecedented suffering, unprecedented abuse. This is far more than an immigration issue. It is a refugee issue, much like we have seen in other parts of the world, and we must stop it. It will not be easy. There are no easy answers and no easy fixes. But I, for one, believe we should muster all the outrage we can to come up with, yes, a short-term fix, but a long-term solution, and come up with a strategy that deals with that. First, we have to identify the root causes of this far-reaching refugee problem. Second, we have to put pressure on governments in the hemisphere that are not handling crime and violence in their nations in a way that prevents families from sending their children across the border in the first place. Third, we need to combat the smuggling and trafficking rings in Central America. That's in our own national security interests. Fourth, we have to effectively deal with the situation at hand and meet the humanitarian needs of these children, and I mean children, 8 years old, 7 years old, no matter what it takes, without placing them in jail in the process. And fifth, we have to deal with the overriding issues and basic causes from a foreign policy point of view. Then we can deal with the join or die gang recruitment and the gang threats against children and their families in the hemisphere in Honduras and Guatemala. Sixth, we have to do all we can to combat international crime, working with our neighbors to end the violence, threats, and criminal activity that is destabilizing the region. And seven, we need to crack down hard on the explosion of gangs and smugglers forcing families apart and preying on young children. I can tell you, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I am seeing day after day violence in so many countries, spreading to so many countries. But I have never seen or thought that I would see refugees from this hemisphere spilling over our borders. We need to act, and we have to deal with the immediate crisis at hand. Now, this is not just a challenge here. Asylum claims in the region, meaning to other countries in the Central American region, have skyrocketed by 700% in recent years. Current law protects the ability of those children under our system who apply for asylum, trafficking, and protection, and another specialized form of release to have their day in court. And not every child will have a valid claim, and those who do not will ultimately be deported and reintegrated back to what is obviously a violent set of circumstances as it exists today, but that will be the case. But it is critically important that every child be given the chance to have due process under our existing law so we don't inadvertently return them to death or violence. There are better ways to deal with this population than through detention or expedited proceedings that don't undermine that due process. I'd like the administration to explore the use of alternatives to detention for families that we want to monitor and make sure that they show up at their court proceedings. This supplemental appropriations bill should also include the opportunity to make sure that we look at those systems and that the representation of children in court is an adequate one. Now, while the short-term needs are very pressing, we must also not ignore the long-term importance of shoring up our regional security in Central America. Congress should increase funding for CARSI, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, to assist with narcotics interdiction, institutional capacity building, and violence prevention. State and USAID must develop a long-term strategy that includes increased development budgets to support sustainable growth. The Millennium Challenge Corporation should accelerate engagement in the region. I also think the State Department should designate a high-level coordinator and establish an office to be the focal point for policy formulation and a response to humanitarian concerns facing children escaping this region. And lastly, state and USAID should work together to establish effective repatriation and reintegration programs for children who are returned to their home countries. And, Mr. President, if we don't deal with the root causes, this is what's going to happen. We'll expedite the process, we'll deport, and when they go home and face the same violence that we have done nothing to change, their option will still be the same: flee or die. And they will take the risk all over again, and we will have the challenge all over again. Now, there are no easy answers, but I truly believe at the end of the day, immigration reform, which had very significant border protection provisions, very significant anti-trafficking and smuggling of individuals in terms of assistance to deal with those challenges, would have been and is still incredibly important. Convincing our Republican colleagues in the House that if we continue to do nothing, there will continue to be trouble in our borders and the refugee problem only will get worse seems to be a difficult proposition. The fact is, the Senate-passed bill actually contains important border security measures. If it had been passed in the House a year ago, when the Senate passed it and sent it over there, then maybe we would have preempted a good part of the challenge we have today. It contains anti-smuggling, anti-trafficking measures. It contains provisions to address criminal activity, and yet the House Republican leadership cannot bring itself to marginalize the extreme right wing and do what is right and just and fair. Bottom line is that we have to attack this problem from a refugee perspective, a foreign policy perspective, and a national security perspective. We need to do all we can to maximize our effort to fight the criminals, increase development opportunities, and provide the type of economic statecraft that can provide relief. And we have to give families a chance to fight back economically and politically against those who are causing the violence, the illicit trafficking, the gang and drug violence, and those running the criminal networks in the region. Mr. President, I'm concerned and I'm angry, and it's time to fight back. But it's also time to deal with a crisis that is upon us, and we can only do that if we give the President the resources to meet the challenge. Failure to be willing to support the resources to do that will rest on those who cast a negative vote, and therefore, from my perspective, will risk the national security along the border of the United States, will risk the consequences of the humanitarian and refugee crisis that will continue to flow, will risk the consequences of the drug traffickers in Central America, the gangs in Central America, all who use that as a route to come to the United States. It's easy to say no. It's far more difficult to be constructive. And so far, what I've heard in response to this crisis is the negativity of no, the criticism of the President for using executive powers when the Congress of the United States fails to act in its own right. You can't have it both ways. This is a moment to call for the greater interests of the nation than to play the partisan politics that I've seen unfold so far.